and pawn endgames today. Rook and pawn endgames, and then 3 viewer games is what I had in mind. So yeah, let's take a look. I guess I have 2 positions that I wanted to look at. These are both from classic basic chess endgames. They have a lot of material here. Basically, a lot of different a lot of different rook and pawn endgames to play. Yeah, we can just get started on that. Let me see. I guess we can start with. I have 2 main ones, so I guess we can take a look. Okay. All right. Let's start with this one. This is a Latortsev versus Chekover. And here, White's got to play his king to the queen side, but he leaves. But basically, this leaves his king side exposed. So this ends up being a draw. But we can look at the game continuation. So basically, the issue here is that this moving this king side, or moving this king to the king side. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Rorim. Thank you very much for joining the stream. But yeah, so this is a rook and pawn endgame, and it's a draw. So here, king to e3, king to f5, rook to d2. And by the way, if the rooks trade off here, this ends up being a win for White. So this is rook to d2, rook to c1, king to d3, king to g4. And basically, if the king tries, so the point of this is basically to demonstrate the following, which is that it's a draw because this ends up being a this ends up being a situation where White's or Black's king can get in through the king side, and White's king can't provide an effective resource to defend this pawn over here. So so in this case, that's so here, king to d3, king to g4, rook to c2. So White is using this tactic of moving his rook over and then moving his king over behind the rook. So rook to c2, rook to d1, king to e2. And basically this is a retreat. So this is basically, this undoes sort of what White had been shooting for previously. White had been using his rook and moving his rook over in order to get his king behind the rook. But here with king to d2, rook to e5, and then basically this plan has not continued is the idea. White hasn't used his king to move over, and basically, now White's going to try a different strategy. So this is the game strategy. Effectively, White had been trying to move his rook and king over, but here, basically this ends up being kind of, ineffective. So a4, f5, rook to a2, rook to a5, king c3. So here basically, king to d2. Okay, rook to a1 here, king e3, rook e1 check, king to d2, rook to e5, and basically here, hey, good morning, Anch. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Rook to e5, a4, f5, rook a2, rook a5, king to c3, f4, king to b4, rook to a8, rook to a3, rook to b8, king to c5, rook to b2, a5, Rook takes f2. So basically, this is this is a 20 move endgame. This plays out. This is basically we'll go through it again. I was just sort of printing it out. Hey, good morning, Anch. How's it going? G takes f4. Rook takes f4. a6, and basically white is going to be pushing for this this pawn to queen. Rook f8. a7. Rook a8. King to b6, g5, pawn takes, and yeah, so basically, yeah, it's good, good. Just looking over this endgame. So rook a8 is a defensive move for black here, but already the drawing chances are really the drawing chances are really shifting. So rook a8, king b6, pawn takes g5 here. King to b7, rook takes a7, king takes a7, king to f4. Oh, no worries, no worries. King to f4, king to b6, g4, king to c5, g3, and this is a draw. So basically, this is the game situation. We've sort of played it out, and we can take a look. So basically, what happens here? White's interested in basically moving over this king to the queen side, but in order to move the king to the queen side, he has to basically eliminate his defense on the. Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. That's good to know. Alexandre. Interesting. I don't know why the bot wouldn't do it, but yeah, rook to so basically here, king to d3, rook to c2, and this king's moving over, but also has to maintain defense on these pawns. So it's a difficult position for white. Not so clear exactly what you should do. But here, rook to a1, king to d3, and basically this white this white king is pushing, and also white's basically pushing through this pushing through this pawn. The issue is that there basically become too many opportunities for black's king to get in and black's king to trade. One of the key things about this position is that there ends up being a draw in this situation, in which there's basically the pawns are at g2 and h3 is instead of g2 and h4, or g3 and h4. This largely, this is Alatortsev versus Chekhover. This is an old rook and pawn endgame. Basically a game from 1937 and out of the book, basic chess endgames. But yeah, if you have any questions, Alexandre, please just ask them. But yeah, this is basically an old rook and pawn endgame. So basically what the king's trying to do is the king's trying to get over and provide defense for this pawn. If the king can go over and provide defense for this pawn, then then basically this pawn will have much better chances of queening. But the issue is that this king can come in and start attacking on the queen side, or attacking on the king side, if the white king moves over to the king side. So here, king to f5, rook to d2, and basically the rook and pawns are kind of playing over. This basically rook to a1, king to e3. Basically, white is going to make his best attempt to try to get over there. And the question is, can white ever can white do this quickly enough to prevent this whole king side from liquidating? If the king side liquidates, so basically if this pawn is able to queen, but black gets to trade one of his pawns for, or basically ends up with one pawn on this side versus 0 pawns on this side, it ends up being a draw, because this king is so far displaced, and black can just basically keep advancing his pawn. So that's the main point of this endgame. It's pretty instructive, pretty helpful actually if you think about it. These types of things are a little bit difficult, but they are very high level stuff. So learning these king, rook, and pawn end games well, this is very valuable information. But the idea that this king moves over and this king blocks the this rook can be used as a blocking mechanism for this king. Helps the king move over to the queen side while this king's moving over to the king side. A big important part of this is that if the pawns are placed differently so that the black king can't get in and make threats to eliminate pawns, that it ends up being a win for white. That's important. We can take a look at it in a second, but I just want to go over the main line again. Basically, this white king is going to make his way over to try to threaten this rook, and this pawn is going to continue to advance. So rook to b2, and basically things are going fine here. This is the situation that white needs to avoid, basically. Where basically white trades off his pawns, his rook and pawn here. King to b7, king takes a7, and basically this ends up being a draw because this king can't get over and eliminate the pawn quickly enough. Black will play something like king to h4, g4, g3, and there's nothing that white's going to be able to do to stop this pawn quickly enough. This pawn's going to end up queening, and basically this rook is going to end up needing to be traded for the pawn, the same way that the black rook needed to end up being traded for the white pawn. So this ends up being a draw. This is a very important kind of instructive thing. I want to go over it a few times. Rook to d2, rook to c1, rook king to d3, and basically white is trying to maintain, basically first idea, black can't trade the rooks. That is probably, I guess I want to go over kind of the most basic stuff from this endgame first. If black trades off the rooks, okay, so if, rook goes to d2, rook takes d2, king takes d2, this pawn is going to provide a win for white. I don't know if this pawn will queen. It's going to try, but if this pawn queens, then that ends up being a win for white. And if this king has to march over to take it, then this king's going to come up and take these pawns, which is going to provide another win for white. So overall, I think that those, that's the first concept. So the first idea in this endgame is this king can't trade, or white can't trade off rooks here. If white rook goes to d2, rook takes d2, king takes d2, basically this king's going to come over to the queen side, and then this king's going to come up and basically get into the king side's pawns. So the rook is never tradable here. But with that said, black still has good drawing chances. So this king is going to basically come over in this direction and clear off one of these pawns. What this king needs, okay, is for the kingside pawns to come down to one black pawn for black versus zero black, or versus zero pawns for white. If that happens, and if this king is displaced, like this king is way over here, then this is going to end up being a draw, because the king's not going to be able to make his way back quickly enough to trade off for the rook pawn. So here we go, rook to c2, and basically rook to d1, king to e2, rook to a1. Basically, this king is going to try to push over to the queen side, and this rook is basically going to try to block the king side, or block the advance of the queen side pawn to make the king have to go over there. And then if the king has to go over there and this rook has to take the pawns, then hopefully by that point black has traded off his pawns for white's pawns. If it ends up in a situation where the king is on like a7 and black has a pawn, it ends up being a draw. So let's just show how this happens in practice. Rook to e5, a4, f5, rook to a2, and basically, hey, cool, yeah, thanks, Roram. I do a simul every Tuesday. We were gonna do that next week, but yeah, good question. It's Roram. I don't generally play the viewers. I think that playing the viewers is kind of what many streamers do, but I do a simul every Tuesday. So yeah, this is the coaching. Just to be clear, basically, I go through endgames. I go through endgames and openings, and basically, and viewer games. So I do about 45 minutes of lecture on either an endgame or opening. Each lesson. and then I do 45 minutes of reviewing viewer games. So yeah, I guess that's my main point, Roram. If you want free lessons, this is a great place to do it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'm very happy to take as many questions as people can send in. So yeah, just feel free to ask. I don't do one-on-one coaching. To be honest, I think one-on-one coaching doesn't make a ton of sense. One-on-one coaching, honestly, at this point, I feel like it's not really fair to charge for chess lessons, and basically, this play, or basically this idea, basically giving free lessons to as many people as possible. That I think is the way that chess lessons are going to go going forward. So that's what we're working on here. But yeah, thanks for stopping by at Roram. Every day we have lessons for 3 hours, and stop by for as much as much time as you'd like. Very happy to have you here. So thank you for coming. Yeah. So these pawns are going this direction. Basically, yeah. So in the normal direction. But basically, the point of this rook and pawn endgame is the idea is basically this king is going to have to come over here in order to advance this pawn. This rook has blockaded the pawns, okay? So this pawn can't move forward because this rook is blocking it. The goal here is for black to trade off into a situation in which he has 1 pawn versus 0 pawns and can use his king to advance, and this king is displaced way on the king side. So this is basically what happens. This king has to go chase this rook, right? Hey, good morning, Aphelion. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So king to c3, king to b4, and then basically a5, a6. White can kind of push this pawn forward and advance this. So king to c3, f4, king to b4. But white's basically black is already making his successful attempt in order to clear off these pawns, so that basically he'll have one, and this rook will be, or this king will be displaced. So rook to a3, rook to b8, king to f5, and basically white's pushing forward here. This ends up trading off. So this is basically exactly what happens. So from this point, we have well-defined strategies for each side, right? Black is going to try to make it so this king has to come all the way to b7 in order to disrupt the rook, in order to basically win the rook on the queen side. But in order to do that, so f5, rook to a2, king to a5, and now this king is going to come in and basically force the rook back. But by the time that this king is going to get over there, black is going to neutralize all these pawns here and end up a pawn up on the king side. That's the theme of this game, and sort of demonstrating the resource that black has here. So king to c5, rook to b2, a5, and basically here these pawns are moving forward. A7, rook to a8, and king to b7. Basically, this ends up in exactly the situation that black wanted. Now this is a win, or sorry, this is a draw for black. White has no winning chances because this king is too far displaced to stop the pawn. If it's just the rook defending the pawn by itself, the pawn can, basically attempt to keep advancing, and White's best attacking resource is going to be checking the king with the pawn, which will end up in a draw situation. So king f5, g4. King to c5, g3, and basically there's no way for this king to get in. This basically ends up being this pawn pushing forward, and there's just no way that this king can get back there early enough. So here, 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 and then basically the best choices are, white rook checking the king, followed by g1 queen. So anyways, that's pretty interesting. Again, let's look at the themes of this opening. So theme number 1, white wants to queen this pawn. That's the first idea. So the first thing that white wants to do is get his king over to the queen side. Basically, this pawn can't advance without the support of the king. So basically, rook a1, king d3, king c3, and white is just going to keep moving over here. So that's that's the idea. But the idea for black, the defensive resource for black, is going to end up being blockading the pawn and then forcing the king to basically come all the way over to knock the rook out of the defense of the pawn, win the rook. But black by that point will have liquidated the pawns on the king side. So king to f4, rook to d2, and basically this is going to end up being rook c1, king to d3, king g4, rook to c2, king to e2, and here rook to a1, king e3, and rook to e5. So basically, black gives up on his idea of trying to guard the pawn from behind. He realizes that he can still salvage a draw if he plays rook to a5 and then forces the king to come all the way over to win the rook. Basically, the blockading structure is this. So here, this rook is blockading this pawn. This pawn can't get past this rook without the king getting involved. So if the rook goes to b2, then rook takes a4. If king goes to c3 and b4, then white's going to keep pushing the pawn upwards. But this rook is not going to, this rook is not going to leave the defense of this the defense of this a4 pawn until this king forces it to. So this king basically is required to come over to the king side. These pawns are going to advance on the queen side, and this king's going to come to a8. So king goes to b7, but by this point, this king is so far displaced that black has the ability to draw by playing moves like king to f5 or king to a5, and then moving the pawn, moving the pawn forward to the b1 square to queen. White will end up having to sacrifice his rook the same way that the black had to sacrifice his rook, and there's no improvement here. So anyways, that's the main thing to consider. That ended up being pretty good for that basically ended up being a good endgame situation for black. Black salvages. Black basically uses this theme. The requirement to get the king over all the way to the queen side in order to displace the rook. In order to create a situation where black is able to get one pawn versus 0 on this side. That's really what black needs, is basically to have a passed pawn, to have one winning pawn on the king side. So once that white basically once black gets that winning pawn structure and trades off one pawn to 0 on the king side, then things are basically better for black, and or things are better for black in terms of securing the draw. And the pawn can move forward with the defense of the king, and the white king can't get involved. I hope that makes sense. I hope kind of what happens in this game makes sense. Just so we demonstrate it. I think honestly the game line does a pretty good job of demonstrating what happens, except for this kind of bouncing around at the beginning. Basically, the idea here is you blockade the so king e2. Rook to a1. I don't really understand this this rook attempting to defend like this. Obviously this is never really going to work. So this rook behind this pawn is the key position in this. Basically not allowing white to advance unless the king gets involved on the king side. That's the key idea here. If basically black can continue to work to trade off the pawns on the king side, he's going to end up with one pawn versus 0 over here. This is an idea that sort of the rook bounces around more than it needs to, but the main demonstration position is this. This rook on a8, this rook forced to defend this pawn on the a file, and the only way of advancing the pawn with this king to b6 and b7. If this holds on to this, if basically this, if this king to b6, king to b7 works, then eventually this rook is going to have to trade for a7. But by the end of this king is going to be able to trade off this pawn on the king side. Even though white is technically up a rook here, he has to make the same sacrifice that white did, where basically he's able to play g1 and queen and end up with a draw. So that's a really interesting point. The blockading concept, I think, is the most important here. The blockading concept is what to understand. This king will try to get over, but this rook will end up on the end up basically threatening on the a file from behind. This rook will end up locked on the a file, unable to move to any other files, and the black king will end up in a situation where he's attacking the pawns and trying to generate a single pass pawn for himself. Anyways, I think that's the point. I think that hopefully that's helpful. And yeah, thank you very much for the suggestion. Hey, Samson Jwani, this was your suggestion, rook and pawn endgames. Yeah, I think these are pretty interesting, to be honest. Let's take a look. This is another classic game. This is U Alekhine from 1937. Yeah, let's look. So basically, this the endgame says this is a an endgame with 3 pawns against 2. It is a good suggestion. Honestly, I learn a lot from these, to be completely honest. This book, King and or Basic Chess Endgames, is a book that I should have read a long time ago, to be completely honest. Like, it's the type of thing that higher level masters read and go through. And to be completely honest, I haven't had time to kind of go through it and learn these endgames. But with these types of suggestions, I can kind of just go through the book. It's super helpful for me, more than I think it's good. I think you guys are in a good situation to learn these openings way earlier in your kind of chess improvement cycle. But it's very helpful for me, actually, because I haven't had the opportunity to go through these. And it's really helpful in terms of learning these openings or endgames a little bit better. Learning technical endgames, always super helpful. It's the type of thing that grandmasters do. Grandmasters spend a lot of time doing, and it's really helpful to get a good opportunity to do it in a productive way. So, anyways, let's look at this endgame. This is you versus Alekhine in 1937. Rook to c4. This ties this black rook and basically keeps the black rook to a6. In order to defend this pawn on c6, this rook has to play to b6. It's a single option for black. So rook to c6, rook to b6, king to e2, king to f7, rook to h4. Basically now this rook is trying to secure a king movement here. So white is going to use his rook. It looks like what the point is here is basically the threats from the rook to tie down the black pieces. So here white has already done this twice. He played rook to c4 to force this rook to b6, defending the c6 pawn, and then he played rook to h4, threatening the h7 pawn. So here rook to h4, king to g6. It's funny, they're talking about hopeless lines. They have some sidelines here, I'm not going to go through them. They describe them, hopeless. So rook to h4, king to g6, rook to f4, rook to b3, rook to c4, rook to b6, king to e3. So basically, white is using this kind of what are essentially checks from the rook in order to basically attack these pawns and tie the opponent's pieces to them. Tie the king to the defense of the h pawn and tie the rook to the defense of the b6 pawn. Technically, the rook could defend against both, but then it would be completely displaced in a defensive position, and you could just basically start pushing on the f pawns or g pawns here. So king to e3, king to f5, g4. G4 check, I don't know, sometimes grandmasters do these things in kind of counterintuitive ways. I guess the value of g4 versus f4 is basically it doesn't create any weakness behind the pawn. If f4 here, then the king can go to g4 and start to attack the white pawns. So I guess that the point of g4 is basically to force this king. The king can go to e6, f4, king d5, and basically here this is a situation where this black king is now able to defend this pawn. This is black's defensive or best defensive resource. This rook is no longer tied to the defense of this pawn because this king was able to get involved. So yeah, now this rook can go like b3, b2, and start making threats of its own. If white can clear off one of these pawns, the material is equal, and white's or if black can clear off one of the pawns, then white's material is going to be equal, and white's winning chances will go down by a lot. Having these connected passed pawns is also very valuable for white in this endgame. So king to d5, rook to d4, king to e6, f5. King e7, and again, this rook is going to have the ability to make those basically, I'm calling them checks, but basically threats on these undefended pawns. King to e7, rook to e4, king f7, h4, rook to b1. And by the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to please ask them. I'm happy to demonstrate the opening. I'm happy to go through the book line and explain kind of the themes of this very old book. But yeah, I want to make this as interactive as possible. Please ask if you have any questions about sidelines. A lot of them are addressed. Otherwise, I'm just sort of going through the the theory here. The theory, by the way, is great. This is a very educational opening, or sorry, endgame. But yeah, rook to c1, rook to a4, h6, rook a7 check. And now I think the rook is going to try to. Yeah, thank you very much for joining, Simon. This is this endgames. I understand these are kind of difficult to go over sometimes, but they're extremely educational. Is the main point. They really demonstrate the value of potential tactics and resources that are available to white. In this situation. So basically, so rook to a7. This constant check on these pawns, check on c6, check on h6. This value ended up being, or this basically ended up adding a lot of value for white. And I think the general ideas of these endgames can be applied to a lot of rook and pawn endgames. Technical rook endgames, I know, difficult material, but stuff that can be very helpful, when you end up in endgame situations in the future. To be completely honest, I guess I would say that the efficiency of learning learning endgames, at a relatively low level is not necessarily that helpful. Since we have a good moment here, what I'd like to go through is my list of things that you can do to basically improve your tactics. What's most important, from 1200 to 2000, in improving it from 1200 to 2000, is to do lots and lots of tactics. It's great to know the endgame theory, but if you don't have the tactical strength to back your endgame theory and be able to, if you don't have basically the tactical strength to get to an endgame, endgame theory is going to be of limited utility to you. So I think it's really helpful in terms of where you are in your chess development to learn these endgames. Otherwise you'll be like me and you'll have to go back and learn them at a much later point. But at the same time, I would really say the quickest way that you can improve is not by endgame study. It's by doing many tactical puzzles. So I've got a few different tools. I can list them out for you. Chess.com Puzzle Rush, Chess.com Puzzle Battle, Lee Chess has Puzzle Storm, and basically basically tactics is where it's at. This is great material. This, I think, is very helpful material in terms of understanding concepts behind rook and pawn technical endgames. It's very helpful for me to go through, but I don't want to say this is what you should, this is good stuff to know. But it's not the most important thing for you going forward. The most important thing in terms of seeing quick improvement is basically doing lots of tactical puzzles. That's my recommendation. Do lots of tactical puzzles. Make sure that you can see 2 and 3 move tactics. Those are where most games are decided at club level. So that's not something that any teacher can teach. I think we could go through tactics, but I don't think that would be necessarily particularly helpful. I think that's really just work that you have to do on your own, and that's where you will see the most improvement. I mean, there may be tactical streams, there may be masters that go through on Puzzle Rush and Puzzle Battle and kind of demonstrate what they're doing. But I don't know if that really is super helpful. I think the most helpful thing is really to just set aside the time that you need, put on some music, and do a tactics trainer or puzzle trainer for like an hour or two a day for like a month, and you will definitely see an improvement. So the tools that I'm suggesting, chess.com Puzzle Rush, chess.com Puzzle Battle, those are 2 very good ones on chess.com. Lee Chess has many tactics trainers. Chess Tempo has tactics trainers, and there's a program called CT-ART that is also an excellent standalone program to do tactics training. For tactics training, also there's a book by Block that's very classic. I think there's a book by Renko that's very classic. You can do tactics training in ChessBase as well. Yes, I think so, Alexandre. I haven't confirmed the ones from yesterday yet, but thank you very much for sending in the game. I will take a look. What's just so I know, you are Alexandre on Discord, and let me see. Yeah, I'll just take a look. I have your game right here, Alexandre. After the stream, I'll confirm what time it's at. Hopefully, it'll be relatively soon. Yeah, thank you very much for sending it, Alexandra. I appreciate it. Yeah, so we're going through this opening. Rook to a7 was the last move. Yeah, thanks, Sam Sejwani. I'm thinking of limiting everyone to one game per day. We'll see how that goes for a bit. I hope that's all right with you. But I was thinking maybe we could do, Sam Sejwani, a one game per day for one game per day for like, I don't know, in the morning session, Sam Sejwani, for a bit. So I'll add your games for the morning sessions, and yeah. Since, I mean, to be realistic, since Alexandre is new, I'll probably try to get him in quicker. Most of the time, let me just read your question. Analysis in the middle game is the part that you need to do. The answer is the answer is basically still tactics to that one. In terms of improving middle game strength, tactical training is your is your question, Forky. Basically, if you do a middle game, if you basically playing tactics in the middle game, they're going to help you understand positional improvements as well. There's also a few good strategic trainers. There's one called Peshka that's made by the same people as CT-ART. But basically, that is a good way to learn middle game positions. If you really want to use a book and use book strategy, you can go with Ludic Pacman's Modern Chess Strategy. That could be pretty helpful. But I think the main idea, Forky, honestly, is just tactics training. Tactics training is going to involve improving both your tactics and your strategic play. But yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, if you just basically end up in a situation where if you end up in a situation where you can basically play for basically if you can play for tactical advantages, and you can play for positional improvements, they're pretty related. It may not be an immediate if you improve your overall tactical vision, it may not lead to an immediate win of a piece most of the time, but it can lead you to see kind of, it can improve your position positionally. If you understand positional play, you can apply tactics training, the calculation learned from tactics training, to help improve your positional play as well. You'll have fixed understanding of what a good position is, and then you can use the calculation that you've learned from tactics training to help improve your positional play as well. Anyways, rook to a7. Rook to a7 here basically is the game continuation. Sorry, I wanted to take a look at this. King to g8, rook to a7, king to g8, g5, rook to c4 check, king to e5, rook takes h4, and then I think here here g6. This should provide enough of a strategy to win for white. Basically, with this. White has secured this structure that he needs. Basically, he can play king to f6, and mate is not possible to avoid here. So let's go through this again from beginning to end. Basically, the ideas here. This is the two connected pass pawns. So this is really helpful. And basically, rook to c4 uses this checking idea, basically checking the pawn on c6, checking the pawn on h7 in order to, and basically in order to advance white's play here. So rook to c6 checks this pawn. The only defensive move available to black is rook to b6. Rook to b6, king e2, king f7. Rook to h4. Now you're threatening this. Now you're threatening this pawn on h7. Rook to g6. Rook to f4. Rook to b3. Rook to c4, and basically here, rook to b6. King king to e3. Again, this rook putting checks on the pawns ties this rook from being able to create any play on the king side. That's an important thought. Keep that in mind. Basically moving this rook around. So this rook goes to c4, threatens the pawn. Black has to do something to defend it. He moves the rook back to b6. This rook can never basically start anything because this rook is always tied to the defense of Black's few pawns. This king also can't start anything because this king's tied to that. So creating the situation in which the rook is creating threats to get 2 pawns ahead prevents Black from advancing. This king has secured defense of all of White's pawns, but these pieces basically have to be allocated to the defense here. So White makes aggressive attacking threats that Black has to respond to. That's what's useful here. That's what's useful in understanding in this rook and pawn endgame. And basically, this rook on c4 checking this pawn on c6. The rook on b3 has to defend the rook on b6. The king has to defend the pawn on h7. So this idea of making these threats is a valuable one to understand in rook and pawn endgames. Basically, White puts Black in a position where he can't make any advancement, because if Black ever tries to make advancement, then the rook ends up checking pawns and putting Black in a position where he can't lose them. So g4, king to e6, f4, king to d5, rook to d4. And basically here, this is good for White. White has postponed the attacks from Black for long enough, and now White can start attacking, aggressively here. h4, king to f4, rook to a4, h6, rook to a7, and basically this, this ends up being a successful way for White to advance. g6, rook to h8, rook to f6. And basically, this is going to end up winning for White. So let's just think about the themes here. The themes are more important than the actual game. White uses this excellent endgame tactic. All of the pawns are defended for White, and the pawns are not defended for Black. So if Black ever tries to make any threats, like specifically putting this, rook on b2 into this threat on f2, White can just move his rook over and apply aggressive attacking here. Aggressive attack, rook on c6, rook to b6. This is rook and pawn endgames, Smiggy. I just wanted to show off a few instructive tactics. Sam Sejuani requested rook and pawn endgames. These are interesting. I think, I think basically they show themes that are very helpful to endgame players. I want to, contain that with the idea of 1,200 to 2,000 players would do the best by learning tactics as opposed to endgames. Okay, cool. Yeah, you can recommend the if you send it on the so Lucena positions are a big instructive rook and pawn endgame. Very technical stuff. We can do that. The only thing I would say about Lucena positions, Smiggy, is I'm pretty sure you can find good things on Lucena positions on YouTube. So let's say like Lucena position. You can learn these chess opening fundamentals. These endgames are, I think learning these, I don't want to duplicate. Basically, my point, and I think one of the overarching point of this stream is, I don't want to duplicate efforts. Basically, we have a situation in which there's 10,000 teachers all teaching exactly the same thing. I think intuitively it makes much more sense to just have, one teacher teaching that thing and then sharing it with everyone. I guess that's the main point, the broader point of this channel, and one that I think is the underlying theme of this channel. So duplicating efforts. I think, I guess if you feel strongly enough, Smiggy, we can consider Lucena positions. But what I would say here is that Lucena positions, are taught very well on some YouTube tutorials. So if you really want to understand these, there's a whole total of about, it looks like there's about, I don't know, at least 5 or 6. So there's one, what does it say? After this position, you'll never forget rook and pawn endgames. I think there's one that's like that. So I don't want to. I like it, but yeah, I think watching the video is better for that one specifically. I think that one specifically, the video is good. But yeah, I just don't want to duplicate efforts is my main idea. So these these rook and pawn endgames, I think I can actually add some value to. So the main tactic here, the main thing to understand is the rook is trying to start an attack on the king side. The rook goes to c4, rook goes to b6, defending the pawn, and now basically there's no way for black to advance here. The same thing will happen with this h-pawn. The king will start to advance, and if this king tries to get into the position, this rook is going to attack the h-pawn, and the king will have to go and defend it. Basically using the threats from this rook, this rook is able to keep black from advancing with either the rook or the king. So rook to c4, rook to b6, king to e3, and then g4 is an interesting move. It's better than f4 because f4 lets the king get in, but with g4 you're actually forcing the king either backwards or to g5 in a kind of awkward way. Anyways, f4, king to d5, rook to d4, and basically white's advancing here. White's playing up, and basically white has never lost these pawns. White's been successful to successful in trying to get this basically successful in trying to move these pawns forward. And king to f4, rook to a4, and basically white can successfully advance his attack. And this ultimate position is also probably a little bit helpful. Basically using the checkmating threat. It doesn't really matter that the pawn doesn't queen. White sets up a checkmating threat by pushing the king back. This also shows kind of white's ability to push forward a 3 and 4 or basically a passed pawn and two connected pawns using a king. This is a pretty good instructive endgame here. Rook to e4, h4, and white is pushing the king back. So anyways, that's what I would say there. It's an interesting situation, and the king basically forces the king back to the 8th rank. The white rook plays to a8, and overall this looks good. This looks like a good way for white to win. But the key thing to understand here is, black basically can't lose another pawn, and these threats from white force black's pieces to be tied to the defense of these pawns so that black can't make progress attacking in any way, and white is able to basically move his pawns forward basically advance his pawns forward. That's the thought here. This rook can use its ability to tie down both the king and the rook, and with both the king and the rook tied down, the pawns can move forward and start to advance. Black is never able to start anything here. White just advances his pawns and uses his king in a pretty efficient technique to threaten the rook here, or threaten the king here. Rook can go to a8 and checkmate the king, and this ends up being a win for white. So anyways, thank you all very much for that demonstration. These are super helpful for me to go through. Honestly, I learn a lot. So, it's like the more, I guess I would say the more technical the end game is, the more that I learn from it. So, I appreciate these recommendations. I hope they're helpful, and I think it's helpful to have this instructional material out permanently. But these situations are particularly helpful for me specifically in terms of improving my understanding. But they're, basically I would say it's also very useful stuff to know. It's stuff that unfortunately I never went through earlier. You guys are lucky. You guys get to learn kind of earlier in your chess improvement, these rook and pawn endgames. It's always, it's kind of a dial. Like, the more technical it is, the better it is for me to know it. So those types of recommendations I'm always happy to take in, because I think they improve my quality of play. Anyways, thank you very much for the suggestion, Samsuzwani. Let's move on to the games for today. All right. Here we go. And the first game was from Sumyadeep. Let's take a look. Sumyadeep is playing white here, c4, e5, okay. English opening, I was actually kind of curious, just so we can take a look, what actually is the most common openings played against c4? The most common is knight to f6, second most common is e5, e6 is surprising to me the third most common, and c5 is the fourth most common. I would have guessed that the third and fourth most common would be switched there, But in any case, I think what's good is to have a good response to either of these. I basically, regardless of what black plays, have an idea if you're playing the English of what you're going to do as white. You can play knight to f6 and the Grunfeld against c4, and you can also play e5, which will basically turn into some basically pretty aggressive openings, sort of like the Sicilian with colors reversed. This is the Sicilian reverse color variation, knight to f6. And then here, there's two pretty clear best moves. There's either g3, which is going to end up, I guess they call it the Karls-Bremen system. Didn't know that's what it was called, but basically this bishop fianchettoed on g2 facing a8. That's the second most popular option. And the first most popular option is knight to f3, after which black plays knight c6, and you have the English opening with the four knights variation. Okay, cool. e3, bishop to c5, and so basically e3 here is a third best move. E3 I think objectively is not quite as good as knight f3 or g3, but it's not necessarily bad either. But bishop to c5 really justifies it, is the point. Basically c4, knight c3, g3, bishop to g2. Yeah, I didn't know exactly what it was called, to be honest. But yeah, g3 is a way of looking at this. So knight c3, knight f6, and g3 is the second most popular move. They call it the Karls-Bremen system here. General system, sure. The names aren't that important. What's important is that you know how to play it. So e3 basically is e3 I think is not necessarily one of the two main lines, but bishop to c5 really justifies e3. So anyways, this bishop on c5, how do you respond to this as white? This bishop has done something that it's really not supposed to do, in the Sicilian. If it's helpful, think about this as the white side of the Sicilian. We can take a look, just in case it's helpful. We can look at another analysis board and basically look at this e4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6. Here you'd have to burn an extra move, so say, I don't know, knight to c3, e6, and then bishop to c4. We've spent a good amount of time talking about why bishop to c4 is a bad move in the Sicilian. It's because it basically faces in on e6. This threat, bishop to c4 on f2, this is a threat on f7 if the pawn has already made it to e5. Here, it's just a bishop on a bad diagonal. So this is basically the equivalent thing going on in this English opening. This bishop is now on a bad diagonal facing off against e3. White can challenge immediately with d4. He can play d3, but this bishop's never going to be on a good diagonal because with this bishop on c5 facing off against f2, there's not really much that black can do here. So I think d4 or d4, g3, these tend to be good moves for white, but you don't really have to be too proactive in fighting off against this bishop. This bishop's already placed on a bad diagonal, so the odds of playing any moves as white to place it on a worse diagonal, it's not really worth the time. White should basically defend around this and not be intimidated at all. I mean, basically this c5 is facing off against f2, and it's up to you. G3, knight c6 or castles. Those look good for black. But basically, black has a good position here, or black has a good position here, a good opportunity to play d5. I think, actually, yeah. So I guess what they're saying is that knight to e2 or g3 basically leads to a quick ability to play d5 as black. The engine seems to strongly prefer moves that support d4 and aim for d4 in the near future. So here, despite it not being in the opening book, the engine is recommending d4, e takes d4, e takes d4, or knight to f3, knight to c6 with d4 in mind. Interesting. I'm surprised that the engine plays off so aggressively, like the engine's so proactive in trading off the pawn on c5. That surprises me. I would figure that the opening book moves like g3 are better, but yeah, basically developing this big center is helpful. Developing developing your pieces is helpful. So knight to e2 here, not in the opening book, but the opening book here isn't really that great guidance. The engine seems to prefer, the d4 type moves or preparation moves for d4 as being objectively better. Knight to c6, and then g3. Engine's really not liking g3. I think it's fine. I don't hate g3 here, but the engine seems to evaluate g3 as being inefficient. Let's think about why that could be. I guess I'm sort of surprised by that, because I would figure that g3 is probably a pretty intuitive move. You can play g3, bishop g2, castle on the king side. I guess the engine's really emphasizing development here. Basically here, white is playing the black side of the Sicilian, and the Sicilian is very important to have, solid development. But the engine seems to be, rating d4 and over g3 much more than humans are doing this in the opening book. Here, d5, and I guess I would just say, think about it. This is the, so engine is really placing emphasis on center play. You're absolutely right, Sam Sajwani. Well said. Basically, d4 and d5, those tend to end up being good ways to control the center. d5 specifically, is sort of a parallel to d4 in the Sicilian. This looks like a Sicilian position if you think about it, with the knight on e7 and the pawn on g6. So yeah, just something to think about there. Knight takes c3. This is generally not a good move in the Sicilian. You generally keep the pawn or the knight on d4, but if it helps, and I think it does in this situation, really just think about the equivalent, the equivalent ideas in the Sicilian. Knight takes c3, not super helpful in the Sicilian, not super helpful here. Knight takes c3, knight takes c3, castles, queen to f6, and basically white's doing fine. Queen to e7, knight takes c5, queen takes c5. And basically, white is looking solid, I think. Basically, white has an advantage. White can play moves like b4 and bishop to b2, but overall, yeah, it's a reverse dragon. I mean, I think in that sense, it's really helpful to think of the English that way. Thinking about it in terms of, I wouldn't be too dogmatic about it, but like thinking about, plays in the English. So you can sort of equate d5 to d4 from white. But the move that really, I think thinking the most about the Sicilian theory improves the most on is this knight takes c3 move. Knight takes c3, and you're basically playing the equivalent of knight takes c6 in the Sicilian. You know that knight takes c6 is not very good in the Sicilian, so knight takes c3 is probably not very good here, and it isn't. So basically here, white with b takes c3, again, using the Sicilian as guidance, get this open file for the rook. This is basically the equivalent of the rook being on b8 and in the Sicilian. So, my main point here is that, you can use the Sicilian for guidance in the English to think about what moves are good and bad in general. Securing this open file for the rook, good in the Sicilian, good in the English. So knight takes c3 doesn't allow the same open files, and as a result is much worse for white. This is more than half a pawn worse than the b takes. You wouldn't play, in this situation, you would play pawn takes in the Sicilian. So I think it's a good indication of what you should be playing here. Improvements for white. Okay, so b5 is an error for black. b4 is not as good. Here, d4 places a threat that black can't respond to. On d4, you have this bishop pinning a8. b5, by the way, really creates a lot of weakness. This bishop is fianchetted facing both the rook and the knight on this long diagonal, so b5 is not correct. b5 creates these threats. The most immediate tactical exploitation is d4, but bishop to g2 facing off against a8 for sure. Bishop to b2, f6, rook to e1, and here basically white is better. F4 is an error. So on f4, e takes f4, and e takes f4 is forced. Good question. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of that threat. I think that threat, honestly, I think that threat tends to be a bit overrated. You can play it in the context of, advancing your bishop to h6 with the rook supporting it. But trading off your fianchettoed bishop for the h6 bishop is often not worth the tempo. That's my take on that. But that queen bishop battery, the one where you're always seeing, bishop, the equivalent here would be bishop to h3 with the queen on d7. I've always been convinced that that's overrated. Maybe a grandmaster will be able to teach you how to do that better. But honestly, unless you have the rook and you have a very well established attack, like if you have a pawn storm going, then yeah, that bishop to h6 can be helpful. But playing that bishop to h3, h6 overall, I'm just not convinced of the real value of it. Look, check grandmaster games where it's played. Maybe they'll have some good themes for it. But again, I've been asked this before. I'm not a huge fan of that bishop to h6, type move in the Sicilians. I just don't think it's particularly helpful. Things like h4, h5, and pawn storming in the Sicilian is extremely helpful. But the queen bishop battery, I've never been convinced that that's worth as much as people seem to believe that it is. Anyways, castles, queen f6, knight to e4, and basically I know, but the question is more about why, right? Don't think. I guess I would say don't think about what it is. Think about why it is. Right? Is my thinking on that. So yeah, you do get attached to the g7 bishop on the g7 bishop on the Sicilian dragon. But what I would say is that if it's is it worth 4 tempos used by white? That's the real question. So anyways, think about that. I would think about it in that context, how long it would take white to basically replace your bishop. If you can't successfully replace it, then, you're just worse off with that strategy. Doesn't make sense, so anyways, I see it a lot, but I don't know if it's worth the effort that it would take to defend it. I think if white just wants to, spend so much time on that, feel free, is my approach. Anyways, look to GM games. GMs, I think, play that in different directions. So, that's what I would say there. Okay. So, basically there's a few tactical errors here. So the first idea, first improvement for white. Think about this more in the context of a reversed Sicilian. I think that makes b takes c3 a much more obvious move. B takes c3, and you get this open file for your rook. Very good as of, basically very good, similar to the Sicilian. So that's the idea there. Going through this, there's a few tactical errors. So I think everything's pretty intuitive. b5 is a pretty big tactical error for black. Basically allowing this, fianchettoed bishop to go from being strong to extremely strong is a real error. So this bishop's facing off against a8 with threats on c6. b4, queen to b6, bishop to b2, and basically white is white is looking fine. A better tactical play for white here is d4. On d4, white can basically secure the center and basically play pressure of this bishop on a8, and black can't take back on d4. That's the thinking there. b4, queen b6, bishop to b2, and white is fine. This diagonal is going to cause black all sorts of problems. That's, playing b5 has really not shown its value here. Rook e1, bishop to b7, bishop to d5, queen or king to h8, and basically, I think bishop to b3 feels a little bit unnecessary. Maybe d4. Engine's been pushing for d4 and better center control for white the whole game. That might be a good path forward. I understand wanting to keep this bishop on the a2 versus g8 diagonal, but I want to do that in the most efficient way. Bishop to b3, rook to d8, f4, knight to e7, pawn takes, queen to c6. So f4 is a big error. This runs into major tactical problems for white. On e takes f4, g takes f4, black basically has this completely open kingside. This is very likely to cause problems. So the engine has this immediate knight to f5, f takes f5, f takes f5, which further opens the kingside at the cost of the knight. That's pretty aggressive. But you can do, basically make threats on the kingside without really going all in here. So e takes f4, e takes f4, and basically these threats of black on this kingside overall, this should be good for black. Knight to e5, pawn takes. Black is fine with that full sacrifice, but certainly playing pawn takes f4 was a better move for black here. Knight to e7 is labeled as a missed win. I think that's correct. Pawn takes f4, g takes f4 leads to white's king safety being terrible. So knight e7, pawn takes, queen to c6, and yeah, I think black's following the correct plan and aggressively attacking on the king side. But this attack isn't done efficiently enough. Pawn takes f4 allows, like, it allows rook to e3 among other things. Rook to e3 is a very annoying move that successfully defends the king side. Rook to c1, queen to b6, rook to c5. After this, white is fine. Basically, white has successfully dealt with that king side attack, and a5, queen to g4. And white is fine. White's up basically, I don't know, a decisive advantage. So really, there was one opportunity for black to successfully start an attack. It would be opening up the G file here. If the G file doesn't get opened, white's king safety is a lot better. So that was the missed opportunity for black. So first, I would say, playing a tactic that allows your G file to get open as white is an error. You're going to want to maintain king safety as best as possible. Ideas like queen e2, f3 are probably good, but f4 is not the right idea. Basically, I would say there's two errors in this game. First, b takes c3 is better than knight takes c3, largely because it's the reversed Sicilian. You get that open b file for your rook, and here this is the second attack. F4 here. This is a the pawn with the fork was amazing towards the end. Yeah. I mean, this won for white. There were a number of moves that would have won for white, but this was good for white ultimately. Anyways, very interesting game. But the two moves that I think are good because I think they're both kind of instructive differences. Basically, b takes gets an open file for your rook, which is a lasting advantage in pawn structure. You're going to have opportunities to get the knight out later. You're going to be able to play d4 and knight takes d4. I think that'll be good. But yeah. So d4 and then knight takes d4 will be good for white. Knight takes c3. This is an error for white, and doesn't basically doesn't do the same to advance the queenside pieces. Additionally, this bishop gets this extra diagonal. Probably not going to be useful, but always good to have extra mobility for your pieces. Just the amount of mobility that b takes adds. This full file for your rook and this diagonal for your bishop. That's what makes it more worthwhile than knight takes c3. So anyways, knight takes c3, castles, queen to f6. Here basically white is fine. This ends up being good for white, and yeah. Error at b5 for black. But the issue was, and then the second improvement for white is, you have a king side that's clearly going to be under attack. Your bishop is off the fianchetto diagonal. In terms of king safety, I'm sort of wondering if bishop to g2 was better. Bishop to g2 provides solid defense for the king. Once you take this, once you take this bishop and move it to b3, your light squares on the king side are going to be very weak. So that's something to think about. F4 just opens up the king side for no good reason. Pawn takes and then g takes is forced. And then, you can get threats from the rook into g6, g6 facing the king on g1. So I think that overall that, that is not, that is an error as well. So the errors here, b takes c3, g takes f4, and I think those are both moves that white could have improved on this game. Anyways, that's sort of not what happens. So avoiding f4 there. And white ends up with a strong attack, strong threats on the c7 file, and good situation for white, good play, good win, and I think those were the two inefficiencies that I would be focused on. All right, on to the next one. Next game is from Sam Sejuani. Okay. Sam Sejuani is playing black here. Uh, he's basically going up against the Italian game, and he plays 2 knights defense. Sure. Knight to f6. You know, basically knight to f6 and bishop to c5 are the 2 moves. Let's look at knight f6, 2 knights defense. D3, bishop to c5. And here white plays a very aggressive bishop to g5. Main moves here, c3, castles, knight to c3. But yeah, bishop to g5, castles, I don't know. I guess I would say here, you know, if white has made the aggressive idea of playing bishop to g5, you can play h6, g5, and d6. This ends up being better for black. And black should play h6 or d6 here. Castling into this threat doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, here I think you can play knight to c3 and come up with a knight to d5 threat that's going to be difficult to deal with. But basically, you know, at this point, you know that you're going to have to play probably at least h6. So castling prematurely into a situation in which you're going to start attacking with h6, g5, this is going to be bad for, you know, this is going to be bad for black. It's not the best option for black. Tactically speaking, I'm sure the engine finds a way to make it justifiable. But I think h6, you know, castling here will give white a lot of practical compensation. So I wouldn't castle here. I'd play h6 or d6. Castles, bishop takes, queen takes, knight to e4, knight to d4, bishop takes, knight to c3, d6. And basically black is fine. I mean, you know, this c6 was considered to be better than d6, and knight to d5 was a missed opportunity for white. So I would play c6. The thing about knight to d5 is if it gets posted here, it's going to be very annoying to deal with. So d6, not as good as c6. C6, and you're basically defending, you know, you're defending 2 squares purposefully. You can play d6 next move, but I think it's important to get c6 in. I think this is an improvement, Sam Sejuani. You know, basically it's important to get c6 in here while it still defends the d5 square, you know, while it still basically deals with this threat correctly. So with c6, you're defending against d4 and d5 and b5, and you can feel free to play d6 on the next move. There's just no rush here. c6 actively stops a threat, and d6 is in no way impacted by that. So I think stopping the threat with c6 is probably the right idea. Here, knight d5 was much better for white than queen to d2. And again, I would still play c6. You know, you sort of halfway deal with this with bishop to e6, but the correct defensive move on the d5 square was c6 the whole time. Bishop takes e6, e6. Okay, that was a favorable trade for black. You know, basically you got white to trade off his good squared bishop for your bad squared bishop. That seems to play out well. b3, another mistake. You know, don't generate weaknesses for yourself. You know, this is the same as the last game where basically the fianchetted bishop gets a longer diagonal with a pin on the rook, or a pin on the piece in front of the rook. So yeah, b3, b5, rook to b1, b4, knight to d5 is a pretty aggressive tactic. Just take it. And then, yeah, and then basically here, you know, black is up by an insurmountable amount. Let's see. Cool. Looks good. Yeah, looks like a pretty, you know, basically a game that made a lot of sense for black. So anyways, things that I would improve here, you know, these threats, bishop to g5 was early for white. I wouldn't castle. Castling, I think, will, you know, castling may objectively be fine, but I would definitely go with h6 and g5 before castling. You know, I would not castle into what you know is going to be a disrupted kingside. You know, you can keep playing this, play h6, see how things go, but there's no rush to castle here. I would just play d6, or I would either play h6 and threaten the bishop and make the bishop commit to another move, or play d6 and advance the, basically advance your bishop to g4. Castles, bishop takes, queen takes, and then knight to d4, bishop takes. Things are fine. You know, black is in a fine position. And here's really the improvement: c6. C6 is a better play. C6 facing off against d5 and b5. I think that ends up being a better play for black. You don't want to allow knight to d4 here. Knight to d4 is going to be very annoying for black to have to deal with. So c6 as opposed to d6, better. Bishop to e6 is probably fine. c6 was still getting evaluated as best, but bishop to e6, sure. The issue with bishop to e6 is that the best continuation for white is knight to d5. There you have to take, and then basically you have opposite colored bishops, which don't help you in any way. So yeah, interesting. Pawn takes, b3, b5, and yeah, I think here, I don't know. I mean, knight to d5 leads to a very big advantage for black. So in terms of improving your game this game, Sam Sejuani, I think what you want to look at is basically, h6 here or castles, but it's up to you. So h6 and threats on f6 or d6. But castles is a distant third in the book theory here, and maybe objectively fine, but gonna offer your opponent a lot of practical compensation as white. A lot of ability to attack on the king side. Here, I would definitely not have traded off as white. I would have played knight to c3 and knight to d5, or at least threatened knight to d5. I wouldn't have played bishop takes f6. Simplifying and trading this bishop for that knight doesn't help white in any way. So yeah, knight to d5. And here the move, again, the second improvement of the game, c6, which holds onto the d5 and b5 squares. With c6 holding onto the d5 and b5 squares, you're good. This is better for black. So anyways, c6 instead of d6, play d6 next move. Allowing knight to d5 here was not good for black. Thankfully, white didn't play it. And then from here, especially after knight to d5, knight to d1 or knight to e2 is much better. But after knight to d5, black has won. So those are the improvements. Those are the ideas that I have in this game. Don't castle into to white already attacking on the king side, and don't play don't play c6 or don't play d6 when knight to d5 can be played. Go for c6 instead. Play d6 on the next move. That's my thinking there, Sam Sejuani. So yeah. Anyways, thanks very much for sending the game, Sam Sejuani. I took a look at those games. I'm gonna have to that you sent in. I'm gonna have to take a look at how to pace them, but I think that yeah, probably one per day is the way that we're gonna go. Thank you for sending those though, Sam Sejuani. Always appreciated. And yeah, thanks for that. Cool. On to the next ones. Let's take a look. Cool. This is another one from Sam Sejuani. Interesting. So Sam Sejuani had 2 in this session. So yeah, you guys are kind of making me reevaluate how much to allow people to post. My hope was that we could just have everyone post as much as we want, but I guess practically speaking, that's getting to be a little bit problematic. So yeah, Sam Sejuani's game. This is another one. D4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, e3. Okay, so let's take a look. What I really want to learn more from is the opening theory here. Let's really think about the opening theory. So this is Indian game, right? D4, knight f6, knight to f3. They call this Indian game knight's variation. Most popular moves for black here: d5, g6, e6, c5, d6. Those are all opportunities for black, basically pawn moves that kind of move his development forward. Looking at this, I'm a big fan of the most popular d5 or g6. Those look good. I would probably play d5 here. d5 restores symmetry. Things are fine. Queen's pawn opening, symmetrical variation. No problems are going to occur to you here, as black. So on d5, on d5, e3. Black has ideas like e6, c5. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, feel free to send it, Chess Fan. Appreciate you volunteering it. Yeah, but feel free. If you're on the I don't know if you're on the Discord yet, Chess Fan, but please send it on the Submit Games Discord. But yeah, here e3, e6. Maintaining symmetry is not bad. c4, and I sort of wonder if c5 is playable. So yeah, so this is Queen's Gambit declined now. Basically, Queen's Gambit declined with knight f3, knight f6, e3, and e6. This will probably lead to a more open position, at least on the king side, or on the queen side, the position's going to be open. But yeah, Also, let's just go through this game really quickly just to see if things, basically how it evolves. Um, but yeah, pawn takes, rook takes, and black is fine here. Um, so yeah, cool. Um, Black is better. So d4, knight f6, g6, e3. Basically, black is going to come up with ideas here. d6 facing off against a3. Knight b d7. Black is fine. b4, e5, d takes, knight pawn takes, e6. Okay, so I think that e4 is probably better than e4 seems to start an interesting tactic. I don't know. I guess I don't really want to go into e4. You're right. E4 is recommended as best, but yeah, rook to e8, e4, pawn takes d3, pawn takes. So this ended up basically being decided by this point. Big tactical issues here. Knight to c6 wins the queen. So playing b6 here was an error for black. Yeah, rook takes, rook to e1, d4, pawn takes, and basically black is, so knight takes c5, queen to b6, and bishop takes f6 is playable, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight to d7 forks this bishop and queen. So that's a tactical win. So there's a number of tactical wins here. We just want to make sure to get for that improvement. E5, pawn takes, rook e8, and then e5, basically here e5 is a supported move, so this is an error for white. Pawn takes d3, and black is fine. This is an error. This allows knight to c6, so don't play b6. Yeah. Queen to b6 again is an error. It falls to this tactic. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes bishop takes f6. Knight to d7. This forks this queen and this bishop. If the queen goes to b2, I think rook to c8, and you'd force the queen off of this. I think you force the queen off of this at least. Anyways, it's a complicated tactical position. D4, knight f6, g6, bishop to g7, and yeah, black's fine. So in terms of looking at the situation, ideas, bishop to d3, okay, d5, and black is position's basically equal here. So I think that looking at this this opening is kind of where I want to spend the rest of the time. The tactical improvements in Sam Sejuani's game, I think are pretty easy to deal with. But yeah, cool. So d4, knight f6. Most common move. So basically, I want to look at a few different opening forks here. First, knight to f3. On knight to f3, black has a large number of moves. Most popular three are d5, g5, and e6. Of those three, I like d5 the best. So d5, and white has the choice of whether to basically turn this into a queen's gambit, or turn this into a turn it into a London system. I'm guessing London system is going to be objectively considered to be the strongest, but I could be wrong about that. So okay, so c4 challenging the center, sure. C4, and then black has, again, multiple options. C6, and then basically black can turn it into the Slav with e6. Knight to c3, e6, e3, bn d7, queen to c2, bishop to d6. And now you have kind of basically a semi-Slav line with this triangle structure. This is a reasonable way to transpose this. Basically with white playing this early knight to f3, early d4, going with the semi-Slav is pretty solid. In the semi-Slav, there's a big thematic difference between the semi-Slav and this g6 pawn here. With g6, the bishop can play to g7 and attack this this rook on a1. With d5 and the semi-Slav structure, this bishop's going to go on this diagonal. So that's basically or that's a key difference, I would say, between, the King's Indian defense and the semi-Slav defense. Is basically in the King's Indian defense, your bishop is on G7. In the semi-Slav defense, your bishop is on D6 or B4. So that's, when people are wondering kind of what the thematic differences are between the King's Indian defense and the King's Indian defense and the um, uh, the semi-Slav. The placement of the dark squared bishop is probably going to be the most important piece. So e3 here, black has the choice of attacking immediately with c5 or playing bishop to g7. I also would consider d5 here. I'm sort of curious why that's not valued more highly. And I guess it is. I would think that d5, basically placing immediate control over the center, freeing up the slight squared bishop. I would think that this would be the strongest move. The engine says that it's the strongest move. But again, this is, move 3, so the engine has complicated evaluation. It's the third most popular book move. The engine's actually recommending this d6 move. It's saying that d6 is the best move, and that's well down the list in terms of popularity. Basically, the engine is saying this move, which is played about 2% of the time, is the best move for black. So I think that the engine is probably not the correct thing to guide here. c5 threatens the center immediately. That's a fine thing to do as black. On pawn takes c5, queen to a5 can be played. Here you're basically playing almost like the white side of the king's or of the queen's gambit. Here, knight d2, bishop to g7, c3, b6, and basically I think black's looking fine. This looks good for this looks good for white, but not good enough. Not as good as it could be. Slight initiative for white, solid position, and here. I think, b6, sure, bishop to d3, bishop to b7, castles, and basically black's looking fine. I don't think white has challenged very successfully. I think that basically black has made this challenge with c5 and white has not done something comparative. But again, this is a King's Indian game. King's Indian game with the bishop on b7, bishop to g7, knight f6. Overall, I think the situation is fine. Black can work in d5 maybe, but yeah. Good stuff. d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, e3. Just an Indian game with the bishop on g7. Knight bd2, castles, bishop to d3, d6, and basically here, this is good. Basically this equalizes for black. D5 is more popular than D6. I generally prefer the lines with D5. I think challenging the center quicker is good in the King's Indian defense, but there's a lot of lines here. Anyways, on E3, black can go D5, bishop G7, or C5. I think C5. Yeah, C5 is a different way to play this. This basically turns it into a Queen's Gambit type game. D5 is solid, probably a good way to turn it into the Slav with C6 and the bishop on G7. B knight D2, bishop to G7, B4. This is an aggressive play for white. I'm surprised that this is considered to be the main line. Let's think about this for a second. So basically here we have a situation in which, there's no threats on the board. Black is going to have the idea of castling, or playing bishop to g4, or playing c6, bn d7. White's b4 here. That's interesting. Basically, white playing b4 is a very early expansion. In order to play against b4, a5 is a popular move. So white has the choices of either playing a5 or castling. A5 is given a5 immediately, basically trading, offering to trade off your rook pawn, which is weak, for white's knight pawn, which is slightly better. Is one of the popular options. Here also with b4 you can castle, and basically things should be about equal. If white just continues development, he can later undermine with a5. I guess the book line probably involves a kind of slower undermining of b4 with a5. But here, this queenside expansion seems very early for white. White's not really fully developed. But anyways, that early b4 is a line to think about in the King's Indian defense. it's playable in many situations here, particularly in situations where d5 has already been played. It's going to become more and more appealing for white to play, and winning space on the queen side is going to be helpful. Anyways, this is a bit tangential to Sam Sejuani's game. I just wanted to take a look at that opening theory. G6, E3, Bishop G7, Knight to D2, castles, Bishop to D3. And here, again, I would play D5 instead of D6. I know they're both fine. I know that they're both, they're both in the opening book. But D5 here, I think, is an improvement for Sam Sejuani. Sam Sejuani basically holding up these, basically holding up this pawn on E6, being able to defend it with E6 or C6. Things should basically be fine. Things should be good for black here. And yeah, that's my recommendation. If you're looking for, so there were multiple tactical situations that were different, but if you're looking for just a straight up coaching recommendation, I think I would aim for D5 over D6 here. These openings where you challenge the center earlier, this tends to be more strong for black. White hasn't successfully taken control of the center, so you have a good opportunity to take control of the center here. Anyways, I think that's a good summary. I hope that's helpful. But yeah, I would recommend D5 over D6 here for Sam Sejuani. Anyways, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much for sending in the games, everyone. Thank you very much, Sam Sejuani, for sending in the games. And yeah, the idea was to play D6 to support E5. Yeah, okay, that's an idea. Sure, yeah, that's a break as well. But again, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a King's Indian break, I guess. This ended up working out great for you. I would still play D5 over D6. I'm not saying that D6 E5 isn't a playable strategy. If we look at this situation, D6 is played about 1/6 of the games. D5 is played about 2/3 of the games. It's up to you. You can play this D6 line. It's playable. You can also play the immediate C5 break. I would prefer, just as I don't know. I guess what I would say in my personal style, D5 is better to play than E6, but it's up to you. D5 is played 2/3 of the time. D6 is played 1/6 of the time. Both of those are sufficiently popular that you can choose the one that you're most comfortable with. But basically, in terms of things, if you're actually looking for guidance, I would play D5 over D6. But it's up to you. Anyways, the game ends up in a very tactically complicated situation in which there's kind of multiple tactical improvements for both sides. But yeah, thank you for sending in the game, Sam Sejuani. Thank you very much all for being here. I hope this opening analysis is somewhat helpful. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time, everyone. Thank you for joining the stream. Next stream is at 9:35 p.m. Eastern tonight. That's in about 12 hours. Yeah, and thanks all very much for sending your games and for being here and watching the stream. Feel free to send in more lesson ideas as well. Yeah, thanks for all that. Thank you guys. Have a good one. Have a good day. I'll see you later. Bye.